You've got to sort of play the game that's there to be played. If you want to go and play another game, fine, you can go and do that, but that's leads down a different path. So I played the game that was there to be played.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Live Through That. I'm your host, Mike Hipple, and on this podcast, we'll dig a little deeper into a pivotal moment into the lives of some of my favorite artists from the 80s and 90s. Today, we're talking with Jack Hues from Wang Chung. Just a heads up that this is not a continuation of Nick Feldman's episode from earlier in this week. Both episodes are standalone episodes with different stories. And today, Jack tells us his story about his journey from trying his hand at composing music to new wave hitmaker.
Definitely the first pivotal moment I recall is hearing the Beatles' Please Please Me on the radio, which I've talked about many times before. But I was probably like 7 years old, maybe 8 years old, 1962. So I can't even do the maths anymore. I think I was 8. And in the kitchen with my mother, and it's one of those things, isn't it? When you recall something so many times, you start to recall the recollection rather than the actual thing that happened. But as I recall it, I was just sitting, amusing myself, doing something while she was doing the washing up, and the Beatles' Please Please Me came on the radio, and I immediately heard it as something different, something never before heard, and I got that my mum was rather irritated by it because it has this chorus section that goes come on, come on, come on, come on, repeats, and I remember her going, oh, come on then, and sort of splashing something in the washing up bowl. And I kind of really got at that moment that this was irritating for her, which I sort of liked, and B, I totally sort of identified with it in some curious way. I can't explain why, I got that it was my music and not her music. It was a moment of separation, I suppose, but it felt good as opposed to frightening. And so that was definitely a pivotal moment. But there have been various times in my life where I've heard, I guess, music that was, I was going to say foreign to me, by which I mean, I guess, music I'd never heard before, and suddenly it dropped into place. So an example of that would be when I was in my teens and I started studying music at school. I mean, in the UK, we had what were called O-level music and A-level music. They were what you studied at school before you went to university, And the teacher had left. He was sick, I think, and I was the only kid that did music in the school that I was at. That would never happen these days, of course. It wouldn't be affordable. But in those days, costs didn't seem to equate to actually learning things in the same way. And he left some work for me to do in the class, and the work was to listen to a piece by Franz Schubert, his so-called unfinished symphony. And I remember playing that, and that again was this transformation with classical music, where instead of just finding it interesting, which I sort of, I found it interesting, kind of liked it, but I certainly didn't love it, and it wasn't my music of choice by any means. But that piece had an incredible impact on me, and I found myself, I went and bought a record of it, and I listened to it a lot. Part of the connection for me was that it sounded a bit like the Beatles. Technically, I suppose you'd say it was in a sort of slightly modal kind of place in the way that a lot of classical music isn't. But that, again, was a pivotal moment that sent me off on this quest to sort of try and get to grips with classical music, which I'm still trying to get to grips with it.
Seeing the Beatles was indeed a catalyst for Jack in wanting to pursue being a musician.
Possibly that came later when I saw them on television. I think I saw them on the Royal Variety Performance, which would have been in '63, I think. And the guitars, the look, the whole thing that they had. the screaming and stuff. I thought that's what I want to do. A bit like John Lennon seeing Elvis. That's a good job. That's what I'd like to do. And so yes, and that so I said to my dad, I want to learn guitar, and thank God because he was a musician himself, he was a saxophone player, and he said, yeah, okay, I'll get you a guitar on the condition that you have proper lessons. You need to go. I'll fix up these lessons, once a week. It was actually twice a week that I had them to begin with, and they were nominally sort of classical guitar lessons, I suppose. But the teacher I had, she wasn't. How can I say? She wasn't training me to be a classical guitarist, with perfect technique. She was essentially teaching me how to play songs on the guitar, music on the guitar. So for me, it was a means to an end. I went to the lessons so that she could look at the sheet music of Beatles songs and show me how to play the chords. But I guess in return, I played. Obviously, it takes a while to get to the stage where you're playing Bach and stuff like that. But I did enjoy playing Bach pieces on the guitar, and that again, that's experience of that sort of different harmonic world fed into my sort of thinking about pop music. And I suppose I was very lucky to be growing up at a time when prog rock was the sort of the stuff that was in the mainstream, and bands like Yes and Genesis and King Crimson, those sorts of bands that were using kind of classical harmonies and textures in their work. That sort of all made sense to me and felt quite hip at the time in a way that it probably wouldn't now.
Jack went on to take his passion for music and pursued a classical music degree at the Royal College of Music.
Yeah, so I did my the year at the Royal College of Music, and I guess at the end of that time, I was pretty heartily sick of classical music and the idea of being a composer. And that kind of, as I sort of emerged from this world of Boulez and Stockhausen, music which I still love, and was very grateful to have been exposed to study and so on. When I came out, the punk revolution in London in 1977 was in full swing. And I remember hearing these bands, the Clash and the Sex Pistols, and being again the Ramones as well, a US band, being sort of inspired by them. Another pivotal moment really, and getting that, too much technique can lead you into this sort of blind alley of complexity and losing touch with an audience. And I really got that they were creating their audience, and I think that's such an important thing for musicians and artists in general to do. You have to sort of, if not find your audience, if you can't find it, then you have to create it. And the punk bands were doing that. So that was very, very inspiring. And when I first met Nick, he was essentially doing a sort of punk thing. I mean, music, just like now, if you were looking for a deal, you'd have to be following one of a number of possible avenues in order to try and get signed by a label. Obviously the models these days are completely different to how they used to be. But back then, punk was the flavor of the month, and that's what record companies expected you to be doing if they were going to give you a deal. So Nick had written these songs which had sort of a superficial punk gloss on them. But what I loved about his writing was that he was using quite jazz chords, quite Steely Dan meets Frank Zappa type chord formations. And I kind of understood that very intuitively in a way that the other people who auditioned for his band didn't, or so he told me. So I got the gig with Nick, but yeah, the punk thing was very important, and I'm still a big believer in that, defining what you want to do as an artist and then pursuing it relentlessly.
Jack didn't attend the college to be a rock musician. He was on a path to be a composer.
Yeah, I think I'd got into the sort of that sort of classical. What is it? Delusion, probably. The the composer who just composes. He doesn't get his hands dirty playing gigs and and stuff. It's all very cerebral. I mean, from the heart, obviously, but Beethoven, that sort of image of the suffering artist in the in Poverty and Squalor. I mean, I guess I never really considered Poverty and Squalor seriously. And one of the things that made me turn to rock music was probably the fear of poverty and squalor. So, but yeah, that idea of being just a composing music, and people would be banging on my door to hear my next thoughts. Of course, that's not how it is in the real world. Nobody gives a damn about what you're doing, really. And so, yeah, and I think my great realization about being a composer was that just like in rock music, you need networks. You need networks of people, of orchestral musicians, of great soloists, of conductors, of people who can give you gigs, basically, and I really got that was a whole sort of middle class preserve in the UK, slightly different in the US, but classical music, the word class is is the giveaway. It's in the word, and sadly, that is a barrier, and as a at the time, sort of working class kid, I didn't really understand the language of all of that stuff and how that worked, But I intuitively got that it wasn't a world that I was going to be able to break into, and it sort of sent me back to bands and rock music and a language that I understood,
Wang Chung happened, and you can hear partner Nick Feldman's account of their beginnings in the previous episode. One of my favorite songs of theirs is To Live and Die in LA, which came out between their first hit, Dance Hall Days, and the song that made them a part of the culture in 1986 with their massive song, Everybody Have Fun Tonight. In an alternate universe, though, there's a chance the band could have gone in a much different direction, and the phrase Everybody Wang Chung Tonight would have never become part of the 80s lexicon.
Yeah, there was definitely a fork in the road after To Live and Die in LA, yeah. So To Live and Die in LA was a movie soundtrack, as you all know. But in those days, movie soundtracks were very different from pop singles, top 40 singles, almost dealt with by different radio pluggers, different people with different brains from pop people, So To Live and Die in LA was considered this sort of aberration in a sense, and really just a bit of time off before we got back to the job of writing a proper top 40 single, ideally a number one single, And so the pressure was on, and that was definitely a sort of fork in the road for me, because I loved working on To Live and Die in LA, and that sort of resurrecting my sort of prog influences, really, which is I mean, that's always in the background, but To Live and Die in LA was really about writing, the instrumental music, the long form tracks on the album. Even the song To Live and Die in LA is a sort of contradiction of pop song rules in the sense that the chorus, I remember playing it to the A&R guy at Geffen. We had an A&R guy, John Kolodner, legendary A&R guy, and I played him To Live and Die in LA, the song, and he listened through to it, and at the end of it he looked at me and he said, "It goes down in the chorus," which to him was like suicide, commercial suicide. And I guess it sort of does go down in the chorus a bit, but for me that was necessary for the expression of the song. It sort of sets up this kind of quite serious rock thing, how it goes, and then the chorus is much more melodic and stuff, but anyway, so I kind of thought, yeah, that sort of way of writing, quite detailed, arty stuff, was what I wanted to pursue. But that wasn't the game in town, really. The game in town was having a number one single, So I did sort of struggle with that a little bit. But in the end, as my manager David said to me, you've got to ride the horse the way it's going. And I do get that when you've got some success under your belt, and the project's not just about you, it's about the other people involved, and not least the people who put money into it and want to see a return. Then you've got to sort of play the game that's there to be played. If you want to go and play another game, fine, you can go and do that, but that's leads down a different path. So I played the game that was there to be played, and that resulted in the Mosaic album and Everybody Have Fun Tonight and Let's Go and all of that stuff, which did bring Wang Chung much broader success. I'm not sure that in the end that it totally did the band the best service that it should have, but that's what happened. I certainly don't regret it, and I think interestingly over the years the band's become known, as being kind of in a strange sort of way experimental, ranging from To Live and Die in LA to Everybody Have Fun Tonight, and then also to Space Junk, which is a track that we did as part of a greatest hits album in '97, and again, I guess that was a more, how should we say, it's a song that came out of not thinking with commercial imperatives in mind particularly, but just sort of writing the next song that was coming up.
Did that create tension within the band?
Yes, I think it did. Yeah, yeah. And so there was always this sort of push and pull um, between me and Nick, principally, and sometimes that works really well, and we get the sort of best out of each other, and sometimes it doesn't work so well. So the follow-up album to Mosaic was The Warmer Side of Cool, and I think the pendulum swung much more firmly back into the sort of prog camp there, but not in a terribly for me that album sounds sort of strange. It was a difficult album to make, and although it's got some tracks that have a good go at trying to do something strong, it's I think it's not sure which direction it's really going in. So and I think that ultimately, the band splitting up was inevitable. I mean, it wasn't just those artistic differences, because I think the 80s was also coming to an end, both chronologically and in terms of style. Nirvana, Guns N' Roses were the new bands at Geffen, and Wang Chung was struggling to figure out where they were going. So inevitably we were kind of diminished but by all of that as well. But that's kind of a sort of Darwinian natural selection thing. I don't happen to believe in natural selection, but that's another story.
Everything comes back full circle, and going back to his youthful love of prog rock, experimentation, and a newly discovered love of jazz, he formed a band called The Quartet and released an album in 2007.
That was another pivotal moment. I was working with Chris Hues, who produced Dance All Days, and Chris has produced all kinds of things. Most recently, the latest Lloyd Cole album. He's still very active on that front. And so I was working with Chris. He was producing a band called The Definition of Sound, and called me up one day and said, "Would you come and play a bit of guitar? We need somebody who can play to do something." So I went down to Bath, which is a city about 200 miles from where I live, on the other side of the UK. Thinking I'd spend a couple of days with him, and I ended up staying for about 6 months, I think, working on this record. And in the evenings we used to sort of have a meal together. So the band, which was two guys, The Definition of Sound, they were kind of like rappers, I suppose, really, but they'd done these demos where they were sampling sort of white rock music essentially, and really talented guys actually. And at that time, this was in the mid-90s, it was really quite unique what they were doing. And Chris obviously was understood the language of rock music really, really well. And anyway, so we would all sit down and have dinner together, and he used to play, decide on an album to play for mainly for them to listen to. I think he thought he was sort of educating them. It sounds very patronizing. He didn't mean it in that way at all. It was just like kind of getting a broad overview of the territory. But what he was really doing was educating me. And I do recall clearly that he played Miles Davis's Kind of Blue one evening, and it hit me like a thunderbolt because I'd sort of my dad was a jazz musician, although he was into kind of quite a sort of gentle kind of jazz, Paul Desmond, Stan Getz, those kind of guys he liked. He was not into Coltrane and Eric Dolphy and that sort of stuff. But yeah, and I'd working with Peter Wolf as well on Everybody Have Fun Tonight. Peter was in Frank Zappa's band and was a massive jazz head, and I remember him talking to me about Miles Davis one time, and I was like, don't really know Miles, and he's like, "You don't know Miles?" And we went out in his Merc, I remember, and he was playing me Nefertiti very loudly as we drove around the streets in LA, and I liked it, but once again, as with classical music when I was a teenager, I liked it, but I didn't really get it, but when I heard Kind of Blue, the light just went on, and I got what Miles was doing, the simplicity, especially as a composer. I got that what he was doing was getting out of the way so that great musicians could play to their fullest extent and fullest self-expression. And that became a fascination for me, of working with great musicians who could really play and creating sort of structures in which they could be their best, and that is a slightly pretentious way of saying how the quartet started, which is this band that I've had in Canterbury, in a very loose kind of way over the last, I suppose it's like 15 years, probably something like that, maybe even longer, maybe 20 years now, actually. And yeah, and that's been a sort of exploration, partly of jazz structures, but also sort of progressive rock. And Canterbury, where I live in the UK, has this connection with a particular brand of progressive rock, which is very deeply related as a blend of rock and jazz, I suppose. The principal bands being like Soft Machine. They're the main ones that stand out as being very influenced by free jazz and rock music, and trying to create this blend. And I guess to begin with, completely unconsciously, I was doing the same thing.
So, are there any new projects coming up with Wang Chung, or more solo projects?
Yeah, I know Nick has written a whole load of songs that he wants to do. I, in the last few years, have released solo albums because Wang Chung is a particular kind of animal, I think, and the sort of stuff I've been doing, which is I guess a little more out there and more of a hybrid, I decided would work better as just as a solo project, And this year, in the early part of the year, the inspirations came again, and so I wrote quite a lot of material then, which I've been working on. I've got a plan to put out a single actually pretty soon, because I'm totally fascinated with this current interest in UFOs and UAPs, as they're now branded, and I've got this song that's kind of sort of meditating on all of these on that subject, and I sort of want to get it out there while it's still in a sort of contemporary space, really. So look out, there may be some crazy new music from me.
Nope, you're the first person I told, because I don't want people to think I'm crazy. But right.
Since 2017, everything appears the same. But since 2017, everything has changed. Everything has changed.
That was a bit of Jack's UFO song, Since 2017. I was definitely intrigued by this and wanted to know more.
I'm very interested in these sort of taboo subjects, if you like. UFOs being one. Who wrote Shakespeare's plays is another one that I'm fascinated by. The fact that there's a whole developed school of thought that has theories about other people writing the plays other than the guy in Stratford, and I just find it interesting, that with all of this sort of like mountain of evidence, that people who remain in the mainstream, almost shut their eyes to other possibilities. And I kind of like that multiplicity of possibilities. I wouldn't say I was a believer in one particular thing or another, but I'm definitely fascinated by people who kind of shake the tree a bit, do you know what I mean, and see what fruit comes down.
And that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much to Jack for being on the show. If you haven't listened to our other episode this week with Jack's partner in Wang Chung, Nick Feldman, please go back and have a listen to that one as well. And be on the lookout in 2024 for Wang Chung's remastered back catalog on vinyl. And a quick reminder that you can also buy my book on 80s musicians and where they are today, 80s Redux, and its sequel, Live Through That, wherever you buy your books. And if you like this show, please leave a review where you're listening. It always helps others find us. And of course, subscribe so you'll know when the latest episode comes out. You can also follow me on Twitter and Facebook at Mike Hipple Photo, all one word. Thanks for listening.